My name is Eleanor Marsh. I'm 62 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I had done everything right. I was a teacher for over 30 years. I raised a kind, polite son named Daniel. I stayed loyal to one man, my husband, Robert, until the day I stood by his hospital bed and kissed his forehead goodbye. After Robert passed, my world went very still. The house we had built together suddenly felt too large and too silent. I was too young to feel that old, and yet grief does something to time. It stretches some days endlessly and compresses others into blinks. I blinked, and 6 months had passed. Daniel was the only family I had left. He was married to Kayla, and they had a 4-year-old daughter named Lily who had my husband's eyes. That little girl was sunshine bottled up in a tiny frame, all laughter and tangles of curls. Being around her made the silence less sharp. When Daniel and Kayla told me they were house hunting, I saw an opportunity. Their current apartment was small, noisy, and barely had room for Lily to play. I offered them a proposition. I'd sell my house and help with the down payment for theirs, as long as there was a space for me, too. I didn't want much, just a quiet room, some sunlight, and a place to put Robert's favorite chair. They agreed. I remember Daniel saying, "Of course, Mom, we're family." At the time, those words felt like an embrace. We moved into the new place together, a beautiful 2-story home in a peaceful neighborhood. Kayla chose all the finishes: marble countertops, gold hardware, pale blue curtains. She had an eye for style, and I didn't mind. My room was small but lovely. I placed Robert's chair by the window and set out his old lamp beside it. I told myself I was starting a new chapter, that I was lucky to still be needed. At first, everything seemed fine. I helped cook dinner most nights, picked Lily up from daycare when Daniel worked late, and even organized Kayla's spice cabinet when she mentioned it, stressed her out. I tried not to overstep. I cleaned up after myself, kept to my room when I sensed they needed space, and always asked before inviting anyone over. I wasn't just living in their house. This was supposed to be our shared home. At least that's what I believed. But slowly, the atmosphere changed. I noticed it in the way Kayla stopped responding when I'd mentioned something Lily said that made me laugh, or when she started correcting the way I folded towels. Daniel grew quieter, too. His hugs became brief. His eyes darted when I asked about his day. It wasn't obvious at first. It was a slow freezing, like watching frost creep across a window pane. Still, I told myself not to be sensitive. Maybe they were just stressed. Everyone was adjusting. But then came the moment I couldn't deny. It was a Sunday morning. I had just finished scrambling eggs, the way Lily liked them, and was setting the table for breakfast. Kayla came downstairs in a robe, hair still damp from the shower. She looked at me like I had left a mess in the kitchen, even though it was spotless. Daniel followed behind her, silent. I smiled and said, "Morning, lovebirds. I made coffee." That's when Kayla said it. No emotion, no buildup, just 4 words. "You're not welcome here." I stared at her, blinking. I thought maybe she meant something else. I waited for her to soften it, to explain, to laugh and say it was a joke. But she didn't. Daniel didn't say a word. He looked down at the floor, hands in his pockets. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My chest tightened, and my hands trembled slightly above the table. I excused myself, walked back to my room, and closed the door behind me. I didn't slam it. I didn't cry out. I sat in Robert's chair, still warm from the sunlight. My heart was pounding, not from sadness, but from a sudden, overwhelming awareness. I had no place here. Not in this house, not in their lives. But what they didn't realize was that the house wasn't truly theirs, not legally, not entirely. I hadn't told them. I didn't think I'd need to, until now. I stayed in that chair for what felt like hours. The morning sun had shifted across the carpet, inch by inch, until it disappeared completely. I watched it go. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even pack. I just sat, very still, trying to make sense of what had happened in the span of a single sentence. You're not welcome here." Those words kept repeating in my mind, like a song stuck on loop. Each time they played, they landed heavier, colder. I had heard unkind things in my life, from students, strangers, even from Robert in the heat of grief. But never that. Never a declaration so final, so devoid of room for explanation. I thought about speaking to Daniel, but what could I say? He had been there, he heard it, and he didn't say anything. That silence hurt more than the words. It meant he agreed. Maybe not consciously, maybe not cruelly, but passively. And that still counts. When I finally moved, it was to stand and draw the curtains. I didn't want to see the driveway or Kayla's SUV or Lily's pink bicycle tipped over in the grass. I needed a wall between me and everything outside that door. My room, once a place of peace, now felt like a box I had been placed in to be ignored. That evening, the house was filled with sound, but none of it was for me. I heard Lily giggle as she played with her toys in the living room. I heard Kayla on the phone with her mother laughing about something I couldn't catch. Daniel walked past my door once. He paused. I could see his shadow under the frame. But he didn't knock. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just kept walking. I didn't eat dinner. No one asked me to. I didn't come out when I heard the plates clinking or the microwave humming. I stayed in my room and let the hunger gnaw at me. A distraction I could understand better than what was happening outside. I began to think back. Had I done something wrong? Had I been in their way? Was my presence a burden I had ignored out of love? I replayed every conversation, every small act of kindness I'd offered. I remembered helping Kayla fold Lily's laundry while she complained about work. I remembered cleaning up after their anniversary dinner, telling Daniel to go upstairs and relax. I remembered holding Lily when she had a fever and whispering lullabies until she fell asleep. None of it mattered now. All of it had been invisible. At some point, I realized I had been sitting with my purse in my lap. I must have picked it up without thinking. My fingers were wrapped tightly around the strap. I slowly uncurled them. Inside the purse, folded between a checkbook and an old lip balm, was a worn manila envelope. I had placed the deed there months ago for safekeeping. I never told Daniel. I hadn't meant to keep it from him. It just never seemed necessary. We were family. What need did we have for paperwork? Now I understood the importance of that envelope. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about power. It was about truth. And the truth was, I didn't owe them anything. Not my silence, not my dignity, and certainly not this home. Still, I said nothing. The next morning, I made coffee as I always did. I placed a cup on the counter where Daniel usually picked it up. He didn't thank me. Kayla didn't look at me. I walked Lily to the car for preschool and waved as she drove away. I smiled at her, warm and wide. She waved back, and in her sweet little voice, she shouted, "Bye, Grandma, I love you." I watched the car pull away. It was the only love I felt in that house. Later, I returned to my room and opened the drawer where I kept a notebook. I wrote down everything that had happened. Every word, every silence, every look. I needed to remember. I needed it to be real on paper, not just a bad dream. Then I tucked the notebook next to the envelope. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew this. I would not ask to stay where I was no longer wanted, and I would not leave empty-handed. The house changed after that morning, or maybe it had already changed, and I had just refused to see it. Even when the rooms were quiet, I could feel the distance, like a weight pressing against the walls. Kayla became colder, clipped in her words, polite in the way people are when they don't want to be accused of cruelty. Daniel stayed neutral, passive, as if by not choosing a side, he could pretend there wasn't one. That, in many ways, was worse than open confrontation. I would have preferred a slammed door over the sound of him asking if I needed anything in the same tone you'd use with a guest at a hotel. Each morning I woke up earlier just so I could have the kitchen to myself. I didn't want to cross paths with either of them. I made my coffee quietly, walked out to the backyard, and sat in a lawn chair that still had dew on the seat. I'd sip my coffee and stare at the garden I had planted with Lily, little marigolds now turning orange in the early spring sun. She had called them the giggle flowers because of how they bounced in the wind. It was the only part of the house that still felt like mine. But the house itself? It was no longer a home. The walls had become witnesses. They watched Kayla's smug glances when I walked by. They absorbed Daniel's silences, Lily's confusion, and my invisible grief. And at night, when the house finally slept, I often sat in the dark, listening to the hollow sound of my own breath. One evening, I took down a framed photo from my dresser. It was from the day we moved in. Daniel had his arm around me. Kayla was holding Lily on her hip, and we were all smiling in front of the newly painted front door. I looked at that version of us for a long time, trying to understand where it all went wrong. Was there a moment, a shift, a comment, a tone that marked the beginning of the unraveling? I couldn't find it, and maybe that was the hardest part. That betrayal doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it trickles in through the cracks you didn't know existed. I began sleeping with the door locked, not out of fear but out of instinct. The same instinct that tells an animal to retreat when it's wounded. I was still trying to be useful. I still watered the plants, folded towels, and made dinner for Lily when I was asked, but something inside me had gone very quiet. I stopped offering, stopped reaching. I had extended every branch I had to offer, and they had snapped each one in their silence. The memory that haunted me the most came one night after dinner. Kayla had made spaghetti and didn't invite me to eat. I knew better than to ask. I sat on the patio with a sandwich, listening through the open kitchen window as Lily asked, "Why doesn't Grandma eat with us anymore?" Daniel's voice was a whisper. "She's just doing her own thing." Doing my own thing. I stared up at the stars that night, numb and half hollow, wondering how my son had grown so far from the boy who used to wait for me by the school gate with a drawing in his hand and a smile too big for his face. The ache I felt wasn't just about being unwanted, it was about feeling erased, like my years of love and sacrifice had been swept into a dustpan and tossed out with last night's trash. I had been a mother, a wife, a teacher, a caretaker, and now I was just extra. Still, I kept quiet. I reminded myself that silence could be strength, that sometimes the deepest loyalty you can show yourself is not fighting to stay where you're clearly no longer seen. But in that silence, something began to stir inside me. A reckoning, a shift. I didn't know what it would become. Not yet. But I knew this much. I was done waiting for someone to value me. I had already given more than they even realized. And while they were busy making plans that didn't include me, they had forgotten the most important detail. The deed was still in my name. It started with small things. The kinds of moments that don't mean much by themselves, but when strung together, tell a very different story. One morning, I passed by the kitchen on my way to the laundry room and overheard Kayla on the phone. Her voice was low, but tense. "As soon as it's done, we can refinish the guest room and turn it into my office," she said. Then she laughed. "No, she's still here, barely." I paused at the hallway corner, frozen in place. My stomach turned. The guest room. My room. My corner of this house. She didn't say when she moves out. She said, "as soon as it's done." Like something was already in motion. Like my exit had been scheduled behind my back. I stepped away before she noticed me and retreated to my room. I sat down and tried to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. But the feeling wouldn't leave. That heavy, sinking suspicion that I was being quietly erased from a space I helped create. The next clue came a few days later. I was dusting the bookshelves in the living room, something I did to stay useful, to stay invisible, when I noticed a printed email poking out from a folder on the side table. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. It was from their bank. The subject line read, "Follow-up on home equity line of credit application." My eyes scanned quickly. The message congratulated Daniel and Kayla on beginning the process. The attached document listed their names. Just theirs, not mine. I folded the paper and placed it back exactly as I found it, hands trembling. A home equity loan. They were planning to borrow against the house, my house, the one legally under my name, and they hadn't said a word. The final blow came when I checked my drawer, the one where I kept all my important documents in a small locking file box. I rarely opened it, but something told me to that day. At first glance, everything looked untouched, but the envelope that used to hold the original deed was out of place, slightly bent at the corner, like it had been removed and replaced in a hurry. My insurance forms were shuffled. My last property tax notice was missing entirely. My breath caught. They had been going through my things. The deception wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, calculated. They were building a future that didn't include me, and they were doing it as though I didn't exist, like I was some temporary inconvenience, occupying space they were already mentally repurposing. That night, I barely slept. I laid in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter downstairs. I couldn't tell if Daniel was laughing too, or just smiling along, the way he always had when he didn't want to confront anything. I felt like a ghost in that house, but I wasn't dead, not yet, and I certainly wasn't powerless. The next morning, I made a quiet decision. No dramatic confrontation, no tears, just clarity. I pulled the deed from my purse. I had started carrying it with me just in case, and looked it over, line by line. My name, my signature. No mention of Daniel or Kayla, no legal tie giving them ownership. I remembered sitting in the lawyer's office after Robert passed, still numb with grief, signing those papers alone. At the time, it had felt sad, lonely. Now, it felt like protection. I picked up the phone and called Marla, my friend from years ago who now worked in estate and property law. We hadn't spoken in a while, but she answered after the first ring. "Eleanor," she said warmly, "it's been ages. Everything okay?" I hesitated. I need to know exactly what rights I have to the house I live in. I'm on the deed and no one else is. There was a pause on the line, and then a small laugh. "You have all the rights," she said. "Every last one." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. That conversation didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the betrayal. But it gave me something I had been missing for far too long: leverage. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to warn them. I was going to prepare. After the call with Marla, something shifted inside me. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even bitterness. It was clarity. Cold, clean, and strangely empowering. For weeks, I had been walking on eggshells in a house I helped make possible. I had been spoken to like a burden, looked at like clutter, treated like a shadow on the wall, but now I finally saw the truth for what it was. They hadn't just stopped valuing me. They had begun replacing me, piece by quiet piece. But the difference now was this: I wasn't confused anymore. I sat at my small desk and pulled out the folder I had once buried beneath old recipes and expired coupons. Inside were all the documents I had kept since Robert passed. The original deed, the property tax statements, our revised wills. I combed through each page, highlighting every line that made my ownership indisputable. Then I started a new file, one I would take to Marla. When Lily came home from preschool that afternoon, she found me in the kitchen folding napkins into little swans. Something I used to do when I taught second grade. "Grandma," she giggled, "why are you making birds out of towels?" I smiled at her gently. "Because sometimes, sweetheart, folding something the right way makes it stronger." She didn't understand, of course, but I did. Kayla came in not long after, tossing her purse on the counter and glancing at the scene. "Are those clean?" she asked, gesturing toward the folded linens. Her tone made it sound like I'd defaced something sacred. I nodded, not saying a word. She rolled her eyes and walked off. The woman couldn't even pretend to be gracious anymore, but I didn't flinch. That night, I drove to Marla's office. It was a quiet little space tucked between a florist and a bakery downtown. The sign outside was peeling, but inside, it was warm and filled with the faint smell of cinnamon from the shop next door. Marla hugged me like I hadn't aged a day and ushered me into her office, where I laid the papers out on her desk. She adjusted her glasses, flipping through the documents with a practiced calm. After 20 minutes, she leaned back and looked at me. "Eleanor," she said firmly, "you're not just on the deed. You own this house, solely. No transfer of title, no joint ownership. You're sitting on a piece of property they can't touch unless you hand it to them willingly." I nodded. I had expected that, but hearing it from her made it real. "What do you want to do?" she asked, watching me carefully. I paused before answering. "I want out," I said, "but not empty-handed. I want to walk away without ever having to explain myself to them. I want my decision to be so airtight that they can't undo it with guilt or manipulation. I want peace, not revenge." Marla smiled. "Then we make a plan." We spent the next hour going over options, setting up a living trust, appointing a new beneficiary, transferring ownership of the house to myself through a new legal framework that would prevent anyone from contesting it. I didn't want to sell it right away. I wanted control. I wanted them to feel the absence of what they assumed they already owned. I left her office that night with a stack of folders and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Back at the house, the lights were off. Everyone was asleep. I walked quietly past Daniel and Kayla's room, where soft snoring seeped through the door and into the kitchen. I opened the cupboard and found the mug Robert had bought me years ago, a simple white one with a faded "Best Mom Ever" inscription. I made myself some tea and sat by the window. The moonlight poured in, catching on the rim of the mug. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. And with that awareness came something even more powerful than anger: resolve. The next few days, I went about my life as usual. I smiled. I helped Lily color in her books. I cleaned the grout in the bathroom Kayla never touched. But behind the calm, I was documenting everything, saving emails, scanning financial statements left carelessly on counters, noting dates and overheard phrases in a little notebook I kept tucked inside my purse. I wasn't lashing out, I was lining things up, because when I walked away, and I would walk away, it would be with everything they took for granted. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still folded Lily's laundry and left her tiny socks in neat stacks on her bed. I still swept the kitchen floor every morning, even though Kayla stopped saying thank you weeks ago. I still placed Daniel's coffee beside his laptop at exactly 7:15 a.m., the way I used to when he was a teenager racing off to school. But on the inside, I was no longer trying to be loved. I was preparing to leave. My strength wasn't loud. It didn't come in bursts of rage or dramatic exits. It was patient, calculated, steady, like water carving stone, and that patience gave me power they didn't even notice. The first thing I did was rent a P.O. box. I didn't want any important documents coming to the house anymore. From there, I contacted the property tax office and had all correspondence redirected. I updated the mailing address with the insurance company too. Every form that linked me to the house now pointed to a place they didn't know existed. Next, I scanned every legal and financial document I could find, including the ones they left out in the open, assuming I wasn't paying attention, a copy of their renovation plans, a new budget that mysteriously included future rent savings. They were planning my absence before I'd even packed a single box. I kept everything. Screenshots, printouts, photographs. I stored them all on a flash drive that I wore on a necklace under my blouse. Just another one of my little accessories. No one asked about it. They never noticed. At night, when the house was quiet and the lights were off, I would sit at my desk with a notebook and journal the day's observations. not feelings, facts, dates, names, conversations. I logged every detail just in case I ever needed to defend myself. Not because I planned to start a war, but because I was making sure they couldn't. Kayla remained aloof, smug in her passive condescension. She had stopped hiding her disdain altogether. I once heard her talking to Lily as they came in from a birthday party. "Grandma's just old-fashioned. One day you'll understand." I was standing right there in the hallway. She didn't flinch. Neither did I. Daniel, to his credit, seemed conflicted. He was quieter than ever. Some days I caught him watching me from across the room with something like guilt behind his eyes. But he never said anything. And silence is its own kind of betrayal. The hardest part was pretending. Smiling, staying neutral. It would have been so much easier to scream, to slam doors, to throw the deed in their faces and demand they tell me what changed. But I knew better. Emotion would only give them ammunition. If I kept calm, I kept control. One afternoon, I took Lily to the park. Just the two of us like old times. She asked me if I would always live with them. I paused, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I don't know, honey," I said gently, "but I'll always love you no matter where I live." She looked at me, confused but content, and leaned into my side. That moment reminded me what I was fighting for. Not just my dignity, but the quiet right to decide what my life would look like next. When we got home, Kayla took one look at the crumpled leaf in Lily's hand and sighed. "Please don't let her bring garbage into the house." I said nothing. I didn't need to. That night, I finalized the trust papers with Marla. The house would be placed into a living trust with full ownership and control remaining with me, but the eventual beneficiary would be my niece Tessa, someone who had never asked me for anything and loved me with sincerity. Kayla and Daniel wouldn't be able to claim a cent unless I allowed it. I set the plan into motion quietly, each step carefully executed beneath the surface of my daily routine. No one noticed, and that was the point. My resistance wasn't meant to be seen, it was meant to be felt. Later, when they reached for something they assumed was theirs and found nothing there. I was getting ready to leave, but this time I would leave on my own terms, with everything they believed I was too weak to hold on to. There's something beautiful about doing things in silence, not out of fear, but out of control. For weeks, I had been watching, waiting, documenting, and preparing. Now everything was in place. The house had been legally placed into a living trust under my full authority. All mail and records had been rerouted. I had a secure financial plan that would allow me to walk away without needing a cent from Daniel or Kayla. Everything was clean, legal, quiet. It was time. I chose a Thursday to leave. Kayla had a long-standing lunch date with a friend that day, and Daniel would be in back-to-back virtual meetings until late afternoon. Lily would be at preschool. The house would be still, just the way I needed it. That morning, I woke up early, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and poured Kayla's into the travel mug she liked, the one with the cracked lid she refused to replace. I set it by the sink as always. I made Daniel's toast as always. I brushed Lily's hair into the loose braids she liked, kissed her on the forehead, and told her I loved her. She smiled and hugged me like she always did, small arms wrapped tight around my waist. She had no idea this would be the last morning we shared under the same roof. When the house emptied, I moved with purpose. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I folded each piece of clothing into my suitcase like it was a ritual. I took only what I had brought into this house: my clothes, my jewelry, Robert's old records, and the photograph of us in front of our first home, the one we bought with our first tax return. Everything else? I left it behind, not out of sentiment, out of strategy. I walked through the house one last time. The walls that once held laughter now seemed hollow. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting my fingers graze the cool marble counter Kayla had insisted on, paid for, in part with my savings. I glanced at the pantry I had organized a dozen times without ever being thanked. I took a deep breath. Then I pulled out a small white envelope from my purse and placed it squarely in the center of the counter. Inside was a copy of the deed, stamped with the official trust transfer paperwork. On top of it, I placed a yellow post-it note, handwritten in ink. "You said I wasn't welcome." So I took my welcome with me. I left the keys to the house on top of the envelope. Then I walked out the front door and locked it behind me for the last time. The sun was warm on my face as I stepped into the cab I had arranged. My suitcase sat beside me in the back seat, zipped tightly. The driver didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and started down the road. I didn't look back. Instead, I called Marla to let her know I had moved out. She confirmed that the final documents had been filed and recorded. The house was fully protected under the trust. If Daniel or Kayla tried to take out loans or sell anything, they'd be blocked instantly. I had changed the locks through my lawyer's property manager. The moment they tried to claim ownership, if they dared, they'd be met with legal walls built brick by brick from their own neglect. That evening, I checked into a small furnished rental in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. It wasn't grand, but it was peaceful. The kind of place where you could hear birds in the morning and the occasional wind chime in the afternoon. I made a cup of tea and sat on the small patio, letting the silence wrap around me like a soft quilt. I felt no guilt, only relief. Daniel called later that night. I let it go to voicemail. Then he texted, "Mom, what is this? Where are you? We found the envelope. Can we talk?" I stared at the message. No apology, no acknowledgement of the months of quiet cruelty I had endured. Just confusion. As if the idea that I could act without their permission had never crossed their minds. I didn't respond. They wanted me gone. Now they would learn what it meant to lose me. Fully, completely, without warning. Not in a fight, not in anger, but in silence. With every string cut clean. The trap wasn't explosive. It wasn't loud. It was simple. I left, and I took everything they thought they had already taken from me. The first call came that evening, and I ignored it. The second call came early the next morning while I was unpacking my clothes into the small wooden dresser in the bedroom of my rental cottage. My phone buzzed across the table, flashing Daniel's name. I watched it ring until the screen went dark. By noon, there were 5 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and 2 text messages from Kayla. Both colder than I expected, but laced with barely concealed panic. "Eleanor, you can't just leave like that. There are things we need to talk about. We thought you were happy here. Why would you do something so extreme?" I almost laughed. They thought I was the one being extreme. After months of being ignored, diminished, and treated like furniture. Now that I had done something they couldn't control, they wanted answers. By the time the 6th call came through, I picked up. "Mom?" Daniel's voice was low, tense, like he wasn't sure how to begin. "I'm here," I said, calm and steady. What is going on? We came home and you were just gone."
"And the deed, that note, what does it mean?" "It means," I said carefully, "that I listened when your wife told me I wasn't welcome, and I believed her." There was silence on the other end. I could hear the faint background hum of the kitchen fan, the same one I used to clean when no one else noticed. "That wasn't... She didn't mean it like that." "Did you mean it like that, Daniel?" He paused. "I didn't say anything." "Exactly." It hung between us, not a weapon, but a truth he couldn't duck. "I just thought things were fine," he muttered. "We were busy. We didn't realize you were feeling unwanted," I cut in. "Invisible? Like a placeholder until the nursery remodel could begin?" "That's not fair," he said, but there was no strength in his voice. "It's not fair," I replied, "that I gave you the foundation to build a life and was made to feel like dead weight the moment it was convenient." I let the silence stretch. I wasn't rushing anymore. I didn't need to. "Kayla said you left the house in a trust. That we can't access it anymore, he finally said, his voice flat. That's right. Why would you do that? That question hit me in a way I hadn't expected. The genuine confusion in his voice, as if protecting my home and dignity required justification, reminded me just how deep the entitlement ran. Because, Daniel, I said softly, I needed to do one thing in my life that was solely mine. I gave you everything without asking for anything in return. Not gratitude, not space, not respect. I lived in silence while your wife dismissed me like a maid, and you said nothing. So I gave you nothing in return. But you always said the house was ours. No, I corrected. I said we were family. I thought that meant something to you. I see now I was wrong. He didn't speak. I could feel the weight of his thoughts on the line. Maybe guilt, maybe anger. But it didn't matter anymore. I don't hate you, I added, but I won't shrink to keep your life comfortable, not anymore. I didn't know you felt this way. You didn't want to know. He let out a breath. So what happens now? I've moved out. The house is under legal protection. You and Kayla will need to make other arrangements. You're cutting us off? No, I said gently. I'm stepping away. There's a difference. He didn't argue again. I think part of him understood, even if he wasn't ready to admit it. When the call ended, I sat for a long time, staring out the window of my small cottage. The light was softer here, the air quieter, no noise of tension humming through the walls, just stillness. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just the truth, finally spoken. They hadn't expected me to disappear, but even more than that, they hadn't expected me to matter. Now they knew. In the weeks that followed, my phone rang less and less. At first, Daniel called every few days, short attempts to explain, to reason, to reverse what had been done. I never blocked him. I just didn't answer. Some messages I read, others I didn't. I wasn't interested in apologies crafted out of discomfort rather than growth. Kayla didn't reach out again after the second text. Her silence was telling. More than any message she could have sent. I imagined her fury when she realized the plans she'd made without me were unraveling because of me. The nursery she wanted to build in my room would never happen. The second mortgage they were counting on was now legally blocked. Their vision for the future had rested on the assumption that I would keep giving, that I wouldn't have the courage or the clarity to stop. But I did, and I had, and now I was finally free. My rental cottage sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood lined with old oak trees and small sunlit homes. No grand staircases, no modern appliances, just peace. I kept the windows open most days, letting the breeze float in while I read or listen to the old jazz records Robert used to play on Sunday mornings. It wasn't the life I had envisioned in my 60s, but maybe it was the life I should have been building all along. I started gardening again. The backyard was small, but I planted rows of herbs and marigolds, the same kind Lily had once called giggle flowers. I kept a photo of her on the mantel, beside a picture of Robert and me on our wedding day. I didn't reach out to her, not yet. She was too young to understand why I'd left, and I wouldn't put her in the middle of her parents' bitterness. But if she ever wanted to find me, I'd be here, always. Every day brought a small victory. The first time I went to the market without feeling the weight of shame on my shoulders. The morning I danced, really danced, alone in the kitchen to Etta James while folding dish towels. The evening I sat on the porch with a cup of mint tea, wrapped in an old shawl, watching the sky turn soft pink without thinking once about what I had lost. I hadn't just left a house. I had reclaimed a self I'd buried long ago under roles and routines and endless giving. Tessa, my niece, called regularly. She lived a few hours away and promised to visit soon. "You sound different," she said during one call. "Lighter." I smiled at that. I hadn't realized how heavy everything had been until I finally set it down. She asked if I wanted her to come help sort the house, the one still in my name. I told her there was no rush. It could sit empty for a while. Let it echo for a bit. Let them wonder what might have happened if they'd chosen kindness over convenience. I hadn't sold the house. I hadn't revoked Daniel's access permanently. I just froze everything. Let the dust settle. Let the silence speak. Because sometimes, silence is the lesson. They had been so sure I wouldn't leave, and even more sure I couldn't. They were wrong on both counts. One morning, I received a letter. No return address, but I recognized the uneven handwriting immediately. Lily. Inside was a drawing, a small house with a flower garden and a woman with gray hair and a wide smile. Underneath, she had written, "I miss you, Grandma." I traced the crayon lines with my finger, and for the first time since I left, tears welled up in my eyes. Not from sadness, from something softer, something more whole. I placed the drawing in a simple wooden frame and set it on my kitchen shelf. That was my victory. Not in taking anything from them, but in taking myself back. In choosing peace over bitterness, in leaving before I became someone I didn't recognize. They had pushed me out, thinking I'd fall apart. But I didn't. I bloomed. The morning I hung Lily's drawing on the kitchen wall, I realized I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. The little frame, crooked on its nail, caught the sunlight just right. Her stick figure version of me stood in a garden of orange and purple scribbles, smiling beneath a lopsided sun. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was honest. And in its honesty, it held something that had been missing for a long time. Love without expectation. I stood there for a while, just looking at it, remembering her small voice, her laughter, her arms around my waist. Whatever else had happened in that house, whatever tension had taken root between me and her parents, Lily had loved me, genuinely, freely. That was real, and no silence, no distance, no betrayal could take it away. In that moment, I didn't feel bitter. I felt complete. I made a cup of tea and sat on the porch in Robert's old cardigan. It still smelled faintly of cedar and the aftershave he used for Sunday morning church. The sky was soft with early light, and the breeze danced through the trees, rustling the leaves just enough to sound like a whisper. This had become my morning ritual. Tea, quiet, stillness. It was my way of remembering who I was before I became too much, in the way, or not welcome. Before my worth was measured in how invisible I could be. I thought about writing Daniel a letter, not to reopen the wound, not to forgive him on cue, but to offer something clear and honest, a final word my way. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't need to. I had already said everything that needed to be said, not in words, but in action. My absence was the letter, the empty room, the frozen title, the unanswered calls, the quiet refusal to explain. These were my sentences now, not written in ink, but carved in choice. I didn't hate them. That was the hardest truth to sit with, but also the most freeing. Hatred is heavy. It eats the edges of your joy, quietly. It waits for quiet moments and poisons them with anger. I chose to release it. That didn't mean I wanted reconciliation. I didn't. What I wanted was distance, not out of fear, but for preservation. The way you build a fence around something that's been trampled too many times. Not to punish, but to let it grow again. The house I'd left behind eventually went on the market. I didn't tell Daniel or Kayla. I let the property management company handle it. The legal trust I'd created gave me full control to list it without ever involving them. I accepted a cash offer from a quiet couple with 2 dogs and a baby on the way. I hoped they'd fill it with laughter and warmth, the kind that had slowly disappeared during my time there. I used the sale to pay off all my debts and set up a modest fund for Lily's future. Not a trust tied to her parents, just a sealed letter and an account in her name that would be released when she turned 18. I didn't want to be remembered as the bitter old woman who disappeared. I wanted to be remembered as someone who stood quietly at the edge of a storm and chose to walk away with grace, holding everything they tried to make her forget she owned.
My peace, my power, my story. Sometimes people confuse silence with weakness. They don't realize silence can also be a strategy, a boundary, a truth so firm it doesn't need defense. I didn't leave with slammed doors. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make speeches. I left with my name on the deed and my dignity intact. And when I wake up now, I don't feel resentment. I feel the soft sun on my face, the quiet flutter of sparrows outside the window, the stillness of a life I crafted for myself. No longer out of obligation, but out of choice. I've learned that not every ending needs a bow. Some stories close with a whisper, not a roar, but that whisper still echoes. And in that quiet, I finally found the loudest version of myself.